Greetings, everyone. It's so nice to be with all of you. I didn't participate in any of the August teleconferences because I was with our group in Egypt experiencing the initiatic journey through Egypt. So it's so nice to see all of you again. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone that this was just a beautiful, transformative experience for all of us. So on our journey in Egypt, just outside of Cairo, we were out in the desert and we saw this big pile of stones. And these were really big stones. Each of them weighed at least 2 tons, and some of them weighed 50 tons. And it was a really big pile of stones. There were over 2.3 million stones in this pile. And originally it was about 481 feet tall. And it was on a very big area. The piles of this stone, this pile, it's twice the area of Rosicrucian Park, this one pile of stones, over 13 acres. It has remained the largest man-made structure for over 3,800 years until a cathedral was built in England in the year 1311. And the shape of this amazing pile of stones in the desert is in the shape of a pyramid, no less. And on top of that, there are shafts in this pile of stone. Now, some Egyptologists suggest that these shafts point toward important stars and constellations. In the year 2014, researchers from the University of Leeds in England used a small robot to explore a 180-foot shaft going from one of the chambers inside this huge pile of stones. A film documenting this exploration shows that there were colored markings inside the shaft. So it's almost probably not an air shaft, but no one knows the purpose of this shaft. Here you can see that it says to the upper left, it shows a robot going in one of these shafts. It shows the first blocking stone. There was a stone blocking the shaft, but the robot with the camera was flexible. So it went around the first blocking stone, and then it reached a second blocking stone and couldn't go past there. Some experts believe that this shaft might have been built to allow the Pharaoh's spirit to cross to the afterlife. Here are those symbols that are drawn inside the shaft. And in addition to shafts inside this huge pile of stones, there are also tunnels. There are tunnels inside this pile of 2.3 million stones, each weighing between 2 tons and 50 tons. This is the shaft. We were allowed to walk through this shaft, but this is not a photo of any of our participants because we were focused on other things. After you walk through the shaft that you just saw, which you can't stand up in, you have to walk in bent over, then there is this stairway going straight up with a huge ceiling. H. Spencer Lewis drew this drawing after he visited this huge pile of stones in the desert. The photographs that we just saw were drone photographs taken by Alexander Landowitsky of course, the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and the only one to remain mostly intact. It was most probably built for the pharaoh Khufu. The Greeks called him Cheops. It's the same person. The Egyptians probably called him Khufu. And he lived between 2551 BCE and 2528 BCE. When the Great Pyramid was completed, the surface was covered with white casing stones made of highly polished white limestone. And this image, which is created by Amazing Beautiful World, it's a website, Amazing Beautiful World, is not fantastical. It would have looked like this, with this polished white limestone on the outside of the pyramids. The capstone, which is missing from the Great Pyramid, is believed to have been made of electrum, which is a metal alloy consisting mainly of gold and silver and traces of some other metals. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid are not perfectly flat, but instead they're slightly concave. So they're concave. So there are actually 8 sides to this pyramid that's on a square. This was noticed in the 1940s when a pilot flew over it. But now that you know this, when you look at the Great Pyramid, you can see that it's concave and actually has 8 sides. Through earthquakes and pillaging, most of the casing stones on the exterior are missing today. No one is certain how this amazing structure was constructed. Many archaeologists believe that ramps were used and that stones were lifted using various tools, with things like levers and sledges, by the workforce that is estimated to have been more than 20,000 laborers. Ancient evidence indicates that they were skilled tradespeople and paid laborers. It's almost certain that the workers were not slaves. The American Egyptologist Mark Lehner in 1999 began uncovering apartment blocks that might have housed as many as 20,000 workers. There are indications that they were well fed. There were thousands of bakeries at this building site. Thousands of men worked together for more than 20 years in teams, which were called gangs. That's what they called their teams, gangs, that had specific roles in either the construction of the pyramid or the transportation of materials to the site. Mark Lehner says that probably an average workforce was 13,200 people and a peak workforce of 40,000 people. And the entire country of Egypt was engaged in building the Great Pyramid. In 2013, an Egyptologist named Pierre Tallet discovered rolls of papyrus in caves a few miles inland from the Red Sea. They're written in hieroglyphs, and they're the oldest papyri in the world. They were written by men who participated in the building of the Great Pyramid, and they include a journal of an official named Merer, who led a gang of 200 men who traveled throughout Egypt picking up food and delivering goods. He and other managers were responsible for getting food from Egypt's rich agricultural lands along the Nile to that huge workforce, as well as transporting copper and turquoise from the Sinai. Copper was the hardest metal available at that time, and if you add quartz sand as an abrasive, it can even cut hard granite. Those who worked on the boats were well fed. Their records show that they ate meat and poultry and fish and had sufficient beer. And working on these boats delivering the materials was very prestigious. The managers whose archives were found, they traveled with their archives because they were expected to keep track of what they were working on all the time. This was like an Excel spreadsheet showing what they worked on, what resources, how much time they spent. When the pharaoh died, they stopped and they closed up everything they were working on, and they buried their archives and sealed them behind two big stones. And the date of these papyrus with all of this information appears to be in the 27th year of the pharaoh Khufu. Now, how in the world was the Great Pyramid built? A Japanese television station tried to recreate a smaller version of the Great Pyramid in 1979, but failed. Here we see a diagram showing the most commonly accepted current belief on how the stones were moved. And there were posts that then had pulleys, and they brought them up ramps on the pyramid. They base this on the fact that similar ramps and pulleys, or places that had post holes where the pulleys would have gone, were found in a quarry where the stone was retrieved from. And this is from a documentary that shows how copper actually can cut granite. And the end result, just by itself, it can't. But when you use sand as an abrasive, it produced this line that you see on the left in hard granite. H. Spencer Lewis wrote the book, The Symbolic Prophecy of the Great Pyramid. And he made many suggestions, including that leverage was used in building the pyramids. There are suggestions that ramps were built on the outside. This is the Temple of Amun at Karnak that still has a ramp, a mud ramp that it's believed was used to build the huge temple there. This drawing shows another theory that the buildings would have been filled. As they were building them, they'd build them up with sand and then remove the sand as they completed the construction, so that the workers were always at ground level with what they were building. In addition to the suggestion that there were exterior ramps, there are also suggestions that there were interior ramps. And an Egyptologist had suggested this shape at the bottom and a ramp inside the Great Pyramid. And then interestingly, when a scan was made of the Great Pyramid with heat sensors, it has a similar design. That's what you see on the top, that shows that it has some similarities with the same design for the interior ramp, although this ramp has never been found, if it exists. Other experts believe that cranes may have been used for the construction of the Great Pyramid. And others believe that levitation, or the ability to move heavy stones in ways that were not mechanical, may have been used. This photo is from Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida. And we had a Rosicrucian group that visited this amazing place a few years ago. A man from 1923 to 1951 single-handedly and secretly carved over 1,100 tons of stone. And this is what this looks like today. And for some of the stone, you can move it very easily just with your hands, even though it's tons of stone. The only hint that he ever gave was that he knew the secrets used to build the Great Pyramid and that you could learn them too. There is also maglev, or magnetic levitation technology, that uses permanent magnetics on vehicles and linear synchronous motors on guideways to levitate and propel vehicles. This is being used extensively in China, it's being used in Japan. And these don't require any electric motors or engines or fuel and have no moving parts on the vehicle. The fastest so far is able to travel 375 miles per hour with a smooth ride. The US Department of Energy is not only researching this, they've published on their website, what if you could travel from New York to Los Angeles in just under 7 hours without boarding a plane? And this, they offer, is possible on a maglev train. So already magnets are being used on vehicles. They're also being used in architecture. There is something called magnetic field architecture, which controls electromagnetic energy to make objects hover. And this includes buildings in areas that are earthquake prone so that they would be able to survive an earthquake. And one of the groups that is working on this has created a small version of a levitating pyramid. And you may have already seen the levitating light bulbs as well. Nikola Tesla filed a US patent called The Art of Transmitting Electrical Energy Through the Natural Medium. He did this in 1905. And when Nikola Tesla, he saw Earth with its two poles as a giant electrical generator of limitless energy. His triangle-shaped design became known as Tesla's electromagnetic pyramid. And it wasn't just the shape of the pyramids, but their location that created their power, according to Tesla. He built a facility known as the Tesla Experimental Station in Colorado Springs, and on another one on the East Coast that sought to take advantage of Earth's energy fields. Now, H. Spencer Lewis said, the Great Pyramid was in perfect proportion. Its apex was above the exact center of its base, proving its builders were well acquainted with that proving that its builders were master mathematicians. Its builders also were well acquainted with that phase of physics known as leverage. Every engineer will readily concede that the huge blocks could have been put in place by employing the laws of leverage. However, the Great Pyramid was created. It's still absolutely mind-boggling. Kara Cooney, who is a professor of Egyptian art and architecture at UCLA, said, the pyramids are there as mountains of stone, proving the otherworldly nature of their divine rulers. You stand in front of the pyramids and you think, it's impossible to build such a thing. That means that their propaganda is still working. End quote. The Egyptologist John Anthony West said, when you see the Great Pyramid, it's like finding a Porsche where only a wheelbarrow should be. Now, what was the purpose of the Great Pyramid? The most common belief in Egyptology is that it was probably built as a tomb for this pharaoh, whom I mentioned before, Khufu, or in Greek, Cheops. Egypt prospered under the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, which is why they were able to fund their massive building projects. This is the only image of Khufu that exists. It's about 3 inches tall in the Cairo Museum. Khufu was succeeded by his son, whose reign was quite short, and then by Khafre, another one of his sons. Khafre was the builder of the 2nd Giza pyramid, and then his son, Menkaure, built the 3rd pyramid. Together, they created the famous pyramids of Giza. Later pharaohs chose to be buried in the Valley of the Kings with its natural pyramid-shaped mountain. This is the mountain that's above the Valley of the Kings. This is King Tut's tomb with the modern entrance, but all of the pharaohs' tombs from this period, which was almost 1,000 years after Khufu, they were buried under this natural pyramid. In H. Spencer Lewis's book, The Symbolic Prophecy of the Great Pyramid, he wrote, "The thesis of this book is the presentation of the mystical side of the pyramid and the support of the contention presented in many ancient traditions that the Great Pyramid was built not as a tomb for a king who sought to aggrandize himself immediately before and long after his transition, but as a place designed entirely and used exclusively for mystical ceremonies of initiation. And incidentally or coincidentally, as a monument for the preservation of wisdom and to be everlasting a prophet of the future." This is a painting by H. Spencer Lewis of the mystery schools. The builders of the pyramid anticipated that the Rosetta Stone might never be found or any similar key, and that even those languages then existing outside of Egyptian, such as the Greek language, might pass into oblivion. And therefore, some other method for indicating the events of the future history of the world would have to be adopted to assure a definite and correct interpretation. Therefore, geometry and mathematics and the principles of cosmology were combined to use as the fundamentals of a language: the selection of the site, the relationship of that site to the point on Earth's surface to the principal stars. It was for the purpose of initiating individuals into the great mystery school of Egypt that the Pyramid of Giza and its adjoining subterranean halls and passages were built. We can understand with pride and joy the great leaders of the mystery schools conceived of building the greatest of all their mystery temples above the ground and in the open space of sunlight and freedom. The Great Pyramid became in one embodiment a house of sacred ceremonies, a school of wisdom, an archive of preserved knowledge, and a monument of prophecy. Now, let's remember that the ancient Egyptians understood that the cosmos is not just empty matter. It's full of soul and energy, and we can connect with that energy. The Rosicrucian Egyptologist Max Guimont, PhD, who wrote The Initiatory Process in Ancient Egypt, which was published by Amorc, he offered the spiritual side of ancient Egyptian practices in that book written in 1978. He states that initiations were for more than just the pharaoh. The pharaoh would travel to the spiritual world to manifest things in Egypt. Initiates were instructed in understanding and working with things on an energetic level. And we can develop our understanding that the cosmos is not just dead or empty matter, that it's full of soul and energy, and we can connect with that energy. In fact, this is the basis of the Rosicrucian visualization technique. We activate what exists on the spiritual plane into existence on this plane by attuning with it with our thoughts. This is a photograph of our past imperator, Ralph Lewis, in what is called the King's Chamber, the initiation chamber of the Great Pyramid. Christopher Dunn, who is a master craftsman and engineer, offers that the Great Pyramid is a large acoustical device. By its size and dimensions, they created a harmonic resonance with Earth and converted Earth's vibrational energies to microwave radiation. The pyramid was built to convert vibrations from Earth into electricity. And Christopher Dunn explains that modern concert halls are designed and built to interact with the instruments that perform within them. The halls are huge musical instruments in themselves. The Great Pyramid can be seen as a huge musical instrument, with each element designed to enhance the performance of the other one, creating resonance. While modern research into architectural acoustics might focus predominantly on minimizing the reverberation effects of sound in enclosed spaces, there is reason to believe that the ancient pyramid builders were attempting to achieve the opposite. This is what Christopher Dunn has written. And he explains how, with the input of sound and the maximization of resonance, the entire granite complex became a vibrating mass of energy. There was an English-German engineer named Sir William Siemens, who was also an inventor and a metallurgist. And he experienced a strange energy phenomenon on the top of the Great Pyramid, when a local guide told him that if he stood on the summit of the pyramid with his hands outstretched, he could hear a very distinct ringing sound. So he did this, and then he raised his index finger and felt a prickling sensation. Then later, while still on top of the Great Pyramid, which is no longer allowed, while drinking out of a bottle of wine that he had brought, a wine bottle that he had brought along, he experienced a slight electric shock. So he continued this. He wrapped a moistened newspaper around the bottle, which converted it into a Leyden jar, which is a device for storing static electricity. After he held it above his head for a while, this improvised Leyden jar became charged with electricity to such an extent that sparks began to fly. It's reported that Siemens' guides were not very happy with this person's experiment and accused him of practicing witchcraft. And then it's reported that one of the guides tried to seize someone who was with him, but he lowered that bottle that had the sparks still coming out of it and gave the man a jolt that it said he was knocked senseless to the ground. And it's reported that recovering, the guide scrambled to his feet and took off down the pyramid, shouting loudly. There's so much still to know and discover about ancient Egypt. This is a photo of the Great Pyramid in the background with the Sphinx in the foreground, which is covered up to the neck with sand. This photo is from 1856. And here you can see what it looks like today. So there's just so much that's still hidden under the sands of Egypt. And this includes the ancient Egyptian language that was written in hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphic script originated sometime between 3250 and 3100 BCE. The last hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt was written in the 5th century of our era, some 3,500 years later. The Egyptian language continued to be spoken, but was then written in an alphabetic script called Coptic, which is still written and spoken today. So for almost 1,500 years, after there was about 1,500 years that no one could read the language. It was in 1799 that the Rosetta Stone was discovered in Egypt by Napoleon's troops. And then it changed hands and went to the British. And there it was deciphered by Jean-Francois Champollion and was released in 1822. So for about 1,500 years, no one knew what the hieroglyphs meant. There are more than 700 different hieroglyphs, And some people suggest that there are actually over 7,000, although not all of them are used regularly. Vowels were not written out, so Egyptologists make the sounds pronounceable by putting an E between the consonants. For example, if you see the hieroglyphs for M and N, they would put an E in between, and then it would become M-E-N so that it can be pronounced. Hieroglyphs mean in Greek sacred carvings or sacred words or symbols. And the ancient Egyptians called them Medju Necher, the language of the divine. And they called their power Heka, H-E-K-A. Heka was a deity who is the patron of magic and medicine. And Heka actually means meaningful speech. Heka can activate an aspect of the soul that's called the Ka. The ancient Egyptians believed that the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, had taught them how to write. And Thoth is often represented as an ibis bird because it's believed that the footprints of the ibis bird look like hieroglyphs. Norman D. Ellis has studied the mystical meaning of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs for decades. And she defines Heka as consciousness itself. John Anthony West, the Egyptologist who I mentioned previously, said that the ancients would have seen the entire cosmos as one magical, monumental act, the manifestation of consciousness as the material world. And we're all, each of us we're all part of that whole. You know, our Rosicrucian manuscript says, we are mirrors in which the divine untiringly contemplates its own reflection. The symbols that I just showed here, the Ankh sign, they mean life or everlasting life. And here we see the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Those Ankhs are part of your museum's collection. And so is this fragment showing Akhenaten with his deity, the Aten, holding to his nose life. So it is the great creator through the arms of the sun, the rays of the sun extending life to the Pharaoh. He's breathing it in. The word Ankh means everlasting life, and it has another meaning. It means mirror. And many Egyptologists have shown examples of the ancient Egyptians appreciating puns. And so when you have this mirror in the shape of an Ankh, they believe that the ancient Egyptians meant this as a pun, because it would then be an Ankh. And I mentioned in a previous teleconference that one time I was creating a mosaic. I create mosaics as a hobby, and I was making a mirror, and I was playing the piece of music called Spiegel im Spiegel, which is the mirrors in the mirror. And as I was laying the pieces around, I thought, what if this isn't a pun, but instead it is showing that typically a mirror would have the face of Hathor, who we see here, she's the goddess on the left here, would have her face. And the mirror at the top would be polished so much that it was a regular mirror. You would see your reflection. So what if instead of being a pun, it was actually a message that with the Ankh, that it's everlasting life, the creator, looking at itself through us. So again, according to a Rosicrucian manuscript, we are all our vehicles in which the divine untiringly contemplates its own reflection. And in this case, it might be Hathor, the goddess of love and joy and music. Again, she was typically on a mirror. This is another artifact from your museum. This shows Thoth on the right, the keeper of the mysteries. He's recording the life of this individual. This is from a sarcophagus fragment with the sacred language. So Heka then is a basic metaphysical concept that our thoughts, how we speak them, and the action that comes from that does in fact create our realities. Normandy Ellis, who I mentioned earlier, said, the ancients knew Heka. This is the sacred power of the hieroglyphic symbols. They knew Heka as a prescriptive language that created realities through the exact words uttered at the right time, properly intoned, and filled with intention. And this is similar to beliefs with the ancient language of Sanskrit. It's believed that if you can intone the sound Om perfectly, that you can achieve enlightenment. And it's similar to the sacred Hebrew language, where you can meditate on the sounds, on the way the letters look, and all of these are used as to activate a trance-like state that allowed the person to ascend into another plane, riding on that sacred language in ancient Egypt in order to be able to converse with their ancestors and the deities. And this now brings us to the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, properly translated, means the book of emerging into the light, or the book of coming forth by day. So that's certainly a very different meaning from the Book of the Dead. Egyptologists called it the Book of the Dead because they found the writings, the text, typically in tombs or on mummies. But the proper translation of what the book is called is the book of emerging into the light. And the text includes magical incantations and guidance to help a deceased person or an initiate in their journey through the Amdawat, which is a magical realm that a deceased person enters after death, that an initiate enters as part of their initiation, and even that we enter each night when we sleep. The Amdawat is another realm that is the source of everything that manifests in our universe. Just like an acorn contains the potential for a huge oak tree, the Amdawat is the potential for everything that manifests in the universe. And we activate what manifests through our thoughts. In order to get to the Amdawat, the initiate or the deceased pharaoh or the pharaoh in his or her lifetime who went to the Amdawat to manifest things like the desired flooding of the Nile, they would have to pass certain tests. They would have to answer 42 negative confessions where they profess that they lived a good life. They would have the confession to Ma'at, and Ma'at is the goddess of order, as in the opposite of chaos. You would not want to attune with the Amdawat, with the place that's going to manifest things, if you aren't in perfect harmony and in perfect order. And the initiates also had to pass a final judgment. Tutmosis III, who is shown here, this is a statue of him at Rosicrucian Park. He lived from 1482 to 1425 BCE, and his name means born of Thoth. Tutmosis means born of Thoth. Thoth was the keeper of the mysteries and the initiator. Along with Queen Hatshepsut, Tutmosis III directed the mystery schools at Karnak, Egypt, and he united the various mystery schools as one single order. This is the entrance to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. We've been allowed to enter this tomb in the past, but it's not safe to do so anymore. They're not sure of the stability. So we haven't been able to go in the tomb the past several journeys. But in the Valley of the Kings, you go up this ladder and then another ladder. You go very, very high, and then you descend very, very deep into earth. And his burial chamber is designed like a huge scroll that goes around the wall with the complete text of the book of the Am-Duat. The background is yellow to look like aged papyrus. And this is the earliest version of the Am-Duat, and it shows the Egyptian deities as stick figures in papyrus writing style. The Egyptians called this the Book of the Secret Room, and the Am-Duat means that which there is in the afterlife. The book is divided into 12 parts representing the 12 hours of the night. And this is just one image from the 5th hour of the Am-Duat. Remember, these are the initiates who are passing tests and trials in order to achieve everlasting life or to be initiated. The sun is crossing over a secret cave that is sealed with the head of Isis above there, and inside is Sokar holding a winged serpent, which represents chaos. Here we have the Duat scarab with the sun. This is pure potentiality, the source of all that will manifest in the universe. The Am-Duat is considered the imaginal world, not imaginary, but imaginal. Reality was both visible and invisible. In Rosicrucians, we refer to this as reality and actuality. The imaginal world is actuality, the pure source. The world around us is reality. In the imaginal world, the Pharaoh aligns himself or herself with the greater than human forces, manifesting a spiritual energy field on the physical plane. And again, this is the basis for the Rosicrucian visualization and manifestation techniques. We attune with what we want on the spiritual plane, on the unmanifested plane, and our attunement activates that condition or that thing into existence. The ancient Egyptians had a highly developed awareness of the interior realms of the deities, of the energies and archetypes. They believed that this goddess we see here, Nut, going across the sky, you can see her feet are at the left and she's encompassing everything on earth. Every night she swallowed the sun and gave birth to the moon, and she did the opposite in the morning. The stars were on her flesh. It was not just the sun god who entered the Duat at the end of every day. All creatures were believed to return to the Duat at the end of their lives or even when we were sleeping. And on her body, on Nut's body, are stars, and that's what we can see. But beyond the stars, in her interior, that's where the Am-Duat is. This is a threshold that we all come to when we die, when everything becomes concentrated in a single point and then disappears from view. And if you're interested in more information on this, one of the best resources is the Shamanic Wisdom of the Pyramid text by Jeremy Nadler. In another article, that's a book, and in an article that he wrote, he talks about the king transforming himself into a falcon. He flew up to heaven, and there he had a vision of Amun-Ra. He was infused with that God's spiritual power and assimilated into himself. So he assimilated the wisdom of the deities. And here's what is written in Tutmosis III's coronation text. Amun-Ra opened the doors for me of heaven and unfolded the gates of the Akhet. And this is the hieroglyph for the Akhet, which is a place of spiritual transformation. I rose to heaven as a divine falcon and saw his secret image in heaven. I worshiped his majesty. I was infused with his Ak power, the luminous spiritual power, and was instructed in the wisdom of the deities. So this is similar to shamanic experiences that we read about in other ancient traditions, read about today, may have experienced, where shamans travel to another realm and they experience a download. A Rosicrucian manuscript states that the Egyptians believed that the material world was the reflection of a spiritual world inhabited by divinities. Mats symbolized the harmony that had to prevail between earthly and celestial Egypt. If you were going to be manifesting, and the Pharaoh had the power to enter the imaginal world and to act from this world from the benefit of the people. It is recorded that a ritual enabled the Pharaoh and initiates to rise toward the imaginal world. While there, he or she created in this invisible world the conditions that they wish to see realized on the earth plane. And again, this is why the Pharaoh was held responsible for the Nile flooding every year and for other important events. This is a board game from ancient Egypt called Senet, S-E-N-E-T, Senet, and it means passing. Every ancient Egyptian played this game. There was the scratches that were like kind of graffiti, well, not graffiti, but people would just scratch a Senet board to be able to play this game. There were Senet boards themselves found in King Tut's tomb. There were 5 Senet boards. Queen Nefertari, there's a fresco showing her playing this game. The Egyptians often had deeper meanings to everyday objects. This Senet game is in your museum in San Jose, and it's very important because one of the squares that is on here for the first time shows the hieroglyph for water, which is representing a body of water that the Ba encountered, an aspect of the soul encountered on its way through the Amduat. So our Senet game is from probably 1500 BCE, and this is the first time that there's evidence that that was the meaning of this board game. And we've set this game up. We created a large exterior game at Rosicrucian Park, and we've oriented it so that the idea of the game is to get all of your pieces off of the board. And that means that you enter the afterlife, you enter the Amduat. You roll dice and you come across these different obstacles that are drawn on the board, like there's a lake of fire, and there are other tests and trials. And the idea is that you step into the East, which is a location for representing rebirth and regeneration, because the sun goes somewhere at night. And for the Egyptian, it goes into the Amduat, it's regenerated, and then reappears in the East every morning. And so that is the meaning of the game Senet which means passing. It's passing through the Amdawat on the way to everlasting life. So now I'm going to share with you just a little bit of the latest news from Egypt. And we've moved up to modern time now. There are three things that I wanted to share with you. They are amazingly important in the world of Egyptology, and I think you may find them interesting. In the back, you see the step pyramid of Zoser at Saqqara, Egypt, which is 20 miles south of Cairo. And it's where the first pyramid was built. It's the step pyramid. And near here, so this was from the very oldest times. The step pyramid of Zoser is over 4,600 years old. And then pyramids moved to other areas, and the Valley of the Kings and different parts of Egypt became important. But much later, Saqqara became important, and people wanted to be buried there again. They wanted to be buried near Zoser again. So about 4 years ago, an Egyptologist found just outside of this area, you can see how close the step pyramid is, he found a few mummies, and it turns out that they are really important mummies. There's a gilded portrait mask, there are individual works of art, there are bronze figures here. So at first they found, I think it was 4 mummies, and they're like, wow, this is great. And then they found 10 mummies. They now have found more than 100 mummies here, and they're stacked up. Everybody so wanted to be close to where Zoser had been buried. Once this area became popular again, this was thousands of years later. It was much later. Many of the items are, instead of being from 2600 BCE, are from 5 or 600 BCE. So it was very popular to be buried here. And they were, instead of an individual tomb for every person, it was a mega tomb. So imagine being the Egyptologist who discovered this. They're estimating that in the past 4 years, they have only found about 10% of what they expect to find in this mega tomb. And it's the largest concentration of coffins ever unearthed in Egypt. And these are not available for us to visit. They're just set up like this so the researchers can organize them, and they're just astonished at finding all of these amazing items. So the next thing that's big news is that soon the Grand Egyptian Museum will open. And this is the Great Pyramid again. And you can see the arrow to the left here. There, the structure that you see here, that oblong structure, was the museum of a solar boat that was found at the Great Pyramid. And this is what that boat looks like. It's as if the pyramid isn't astonishing enough, there's even more. So this solar boat was buried at the Great Pyramid and was disassembled into over 1,200 pieces, laid out in logical order. And then when it was discovered in 1954, was put back together and was in this museum. Experts transported the 4,600-year-old, 142-foot-long cedar wood boat in a shock-absorbing metal container carried by a remote-controlled vehicle. And this occurred when we were in Egypt. This is an amazing procession from the Great Pyramid to the new Grand Egyptian Museum. And a second solar boat was also found many years ago. It's believed that the Pharaoh would have used this boat to travel across the heavens. It's also possible that the ship was a funerary barge that carried the pharaoh's body from Memphis to Giza, or that the pharaoh may have even used the ship to make pilgrimages to sacred sites. There's evidence that the ship was in water in ancient times. And so the Grand Egyptian Museum, this is it in the foreground. This is an actual photo. It looks like a model, but it's the actual museum. It's massive, and it's scheduled to be open later this year. It's been under construction for 17 years. And you can see the amazing location with the 3 pyramids of Giza right by it. And then the latest news in Egyptology that I'd like to share with you is the Pharaoh's Golden Parade. There's a museum in Egypt called the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. It opened partially 4 years ago. And in April of this year, there was a 3-mile parade that escorted 22 royal mummies from the old Cairo, the old Egyptian museum in Cairo, to this new museum, the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. It's not the same museum where the solar boat went. These are 2 astonishing museums. And imagine if 22 leaders of your country were moved in a procession, if let's say their graves had been found. So there were 18 kings, including Tutmosis III, who we've spoken about, Seti I, Ramses II, and 4 queens, including Queen T, the mother of Akhenaten, and the powerful pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut. And it's a very modern museum. And then you go through this tunnel and you go underground to where the mummies are. And this is the vehicle that was used to transport Queen T. And now we're going to watch a very short video of the Pharaoh's Golden Parade. The Egyptians still have that touch. They know how to put on a production, don't they? So this concludes us exploring some of the mysteries of ancient Egypt. And again, for those of you who someday hope to Egypt, I so wish you a wonderful journey there. It's an experience like no other. And for everyone who has already traveled there, whether it was this past month or any time in the past, our initiations still continue.